Hi everyone, this is Megan Dudo. This is the first in a series of videos I'll be putting out in which I will talk more in depth about the issues I wrote about in my campaign platform document to give you a better sense of my thoughts about some of those topics. If you have questions for me related to the topic I'm covering in each video, please go ahead and comment below, but I hope the video content covers a lot of the questions you may have. I wanted to start out with one of the more hot button topics we have to talk about, and that is deed restrictions. The majority of what I'm going to say about this topic applies predominantly to Anderson Mill West, but I will talk later in the video about why I believe deed restriction enforcement in Anderson Mill West is relevant and important to all our neighborhoods. Not to mention it is the case that the MUD also enforces deed restrictions for Hunters Glen 1 and 2 and in a limited capacity for Valente Hills as well. There is so much to say about this topic, but if you have only a moment to spare for this video, the message I'd like to give you is that I believe the MUD is in an important position to empower residents to take ownership of their deed restrictions, to help remove barriers to residents' ability to amend the deed, and also to work with residents to problem solve and build the future community we all want. Despite what any other candidates say, the issues we face with respect to our deed restrictions are not black and white. There is not a quick and easy fix that will address the full complexity of our situation and make everyone happy. But I do believe in the capacity of our community to work together, to compromise, to find the best way forward, not just for ourselves and our personal property, but for our collective benefit. Communities are living, breathing, complex systems that need, just like our natural world, to adapt and evolve. And our deed restrictions play a part in our ability to do that successfully. If you'd like to jump to certain parts of this video without watching the whole thing, I will put timestamp information in the video description, so be sure to check those out if there's something specific you want to hear. I want to begin by giving you the quick history of the Anderson Mill West deed restrictions if you're not familiar, because I think the context of how and why things are the way they are today is important to formulating an opinion on this issue. That said, guys, let's be honest, we're talking about the history of deed restriction enforcement here. It's a little dense, it's not super sexy, so if you're dying, check out those timestamps. The Anderson Mill West deed restrictions were written by the original developer of our neighborhood, starting in the 1980s and up into the 90s. There are now a total of 13 residential sections in Anderson Mill West with separate deed restriction documents for each section. Collectively, these apply to around 1,000 residential properties, and to my knowledge, none of the deed restriction documents have ever been amended since they were written. So these are 25 to 35-year-old regulations we have. And you can imagine that the community has evolved quite a bit in that time. Society has evolved quite a bit in that time. So it's natural that we're going to run into some conflicts between what is written in the deed and what is maybe an appropriate rule to enforce today. And as we'll talk more about, that's largely where things get complicated because the MUD only has the authority to enforce the deed, but not to amend it. That responsibility rests with the residents. And in order for residents to amend the deed restrictions, they must secure a majority vote of all the property owners in their section of the neighborhood. And each vote needs to be given via a notarized signature. So this involves going door to door with a notary and getting property owners' approval for the change. And that's challenging enough, but then on top of that, for sections 1 through 6, amendments can only go into effect once every 10 years. And if they don't get amended by the 10-year mark, they automatically roll over as is for another 10 years. So when you really think about what it would take for an amendment to be made to the Anderson Mill West deed restrictions, it's no surprise they have never been successfully amended. But back to the history. Now, it is common practice for deed restrictions to be put in place by developers to preserve the value of their investment. But when the Anderson Mill West deed restrictions were written, there was no homeowners association put in place to help administer them. And so, in the early days, before the MUD started helping with deed restriction enforcement, it was a bit of a Wild West in terms of enforcement of the deed because individual property owners weren't doing it, at least with any kind of uniformity. And just so I'm clear, this account is coming directly from folks who were there and involved in the community at the time. So these statements about how things were in the early days are not just speculative on my part. But so things were messy, and the deed restrictions were being effectively ignored, if people even knew they existed to begin with. And the neighborhood association of the time, which again is not a homeowners association, tried to help coordinate deed restriction enforcement for the benefit of everyone, because regardless of who you are, no one likes being told what they can do with their property. But deed restrictions work because everyone has to subscribe to the same rules, and it is that collective adherence to the rules that uplifts our own property values. So when you live in a community of people, you agree to contribute to the collective good because you in turn benefit from that relationship. So the Anderson Mill West Neighborhood Association tried to step in and help to get some coordinated enforcement up and running. But without any financial resources to support those efforts, and without the actual authority to enforce the deed in the way an HOA can enforce a deed, that strategy of coordinated enforcement was neither effective nor sustainable. So sometime in the early to mid 90s, the Neighborhood Association asked the MUD to step in and help with enforcement, which a MUD is able to do under the law. And so MUD enforcement of our deed restrictions is something that has been taking place for decades now. It was done at the request of the community at the time, and it was done because the community had already done the experiment of going without coordinated enforcement and didn't like the result. Now, one other thing I'd like to mention about all this is that although the Anderson Mill West deed restrictions do not include establishment of a homeowners association, they do include establishment of an architectural control committee. And the purpose of that committee, as defined by the deed restrictions themselves, is first to review applications for improvements to properties to make sure they comply with the deed restrictions, and also to make interpretations to a section of the deed restrictions that exists in all sections of Anderson Mill West except Section 1, referred to as the unsightly provisions. And that is sort of a catch-all section that covers anything that would make a property appear unkempt. So that's the section of your deed restrictions that talks about keeping your trash concealed, not using your lot to store your boat, etc. But the functioning of the Architectural Control Committee, or ACC, was another component of deed restriction enforcement that was not well managed in the early days of the neighborhood. And so the Anderson Mill West Neighborhood Association at the time worked directly with the developer, who at that time was still around, to shift the membership of the 3-person ACC from the developer to residents of the community, which is where the power should rest. And then, over many years, those committee members delegated new committee members to take their place, and then eventually, a number of years ago, the ACC was placed under the umbrella of the Anderson Mill West Neighborhood Association as a subcommittee to try in another way to help the ACC function more effectively by promoting broader involvement from the community in selecting who serves on the ACC. And one of the reasons I'm talking about the ACC is that you may have heard a lot from other MUD board candidates, Linda Faub and David Flores, in the last year or so about the ACC, how it is illegally impaneled, and how the MUD and the Anderson Mill West Neighborhood Association have been stealing your property rights. And the reason they have been able to gain any traction in making those claims in a legal sense is that along the way, decades ago, when the developer passed the ACC from himself onto the residents, he did so in a sort of sloppy way. And so the record keeping with respect to the succession of ACC members is kind of shoddy. And that is wildly frustrating, but the narrative that's been spun out of that fact is inaccurate and exaggerated. No one has been trying to steal anyone else's property rights. That makes an excellent soundbite if you're trying to run for office. It's a shrewd campaign strategy to breed on people's fear by claiming there are power-hungry individuals out there trying to steal your rights and that you're going to swoop in and save everyone. But it's just not the reality of what happened or what is happening. And I have to speak some truth to this because this message is an exaggerated claim that is damaging the culture of our community and our ability to problem solve together. So that said, going back to the 90s, the MUD took over deed restriction enforcement at the request of the neighborhood. And over the last couple decades, enforcement has had numerous evolutions. And the MUD, in collaboration with other neighborhood leaders, has worked hard to constantly refine its approach. There have been different third-party companies involved. Different players over time on the MUD board have had different enforcement styles. There has been some trial and error. Some things have worked and some haven't. And in the last decade or so, the board has worked very hard to make enforcement as fair and equitable as possible, adopting clear enforcement rules and guidelines. But what you can see when you look at the history is the community's ongoing efforts to make the best of a pretty challenging enforcement situation. So back when I was a planning consultant, I wrote many land development codes, not deed restrictions. Those are written by private developers, but zoning codes. And I also helped administer zoning code regulations. And as a result of that experience, I am of the belief that in order for regulations, no matter who writes them or administers them, to really work, they have to, at bare minimum, have two important characteristics. First, they need to be clearly written. Leaving regulations vague and up to interpretation invites distrust, confusion, frustration, and sometimes inequitable enforcement. And then number two, rules must also be adaptable to account for societal evolution and also to permit clarification of intent. So should deed restrictions be so easy to amend that they become functionally pointless? No, of course not. But there needs to be a process through which amendments can be made, because otherwise you end up with a document that does not reflect the current reality of your community and therefore becomes meaningless in a different way. So how do our deed restrictions stack up to those criteria? With respect to the former, our deed restrictions kind of drive me nuts. There is so much in there that is vague, not well stated, or just omitted altogether. And over the years, this has required the MUD board to work extra hard to administer the deed in a way that is consistent with community desires, but also operate within the law, which means they can't do anything that would constitute amending the deed. And finding that balance can be really hard. So to do this, when appropriate, they've turned to the ACC for guidance, because when the developer wrote the deed restrictions, it was his intent to have a resident ACC to help interpret aspects of the deed. And this intent is pretty clear to anyone who reads the deed. And if you look at the deed restrictions for Valente Hills, Lakeline Oaks, or Hunters Glen 1, they all have ACCs as well. So then with respect to number two, the adaptability of the deed. This is, I think, the heart of our problem. The deed restrictions have never been amended since they were written, in large part because the process to amend them is so difficult as to be functionally impossible for the average citizen to navigate themselves. Can it be done? Sure. But I think history shows that it's really challenging. And the MUD then has to enforce a deed that is out of date, and they have no ability to amend it themselves. So the only thing the MUD then can legally do is decide to uniformly not enforce a rule that they determine to be outdated or too heavy-handed or whatever. And they have judiciously decided to do that in the past. However, they can't really win, because deciding not to enforce a rule has resulted in criticism as well. So they're sort of damned if they do, damned if they don't. And whether the MUD enforces a particular a regulation or not, it's still a part of the deed restrictions you signed on to when you bought your home. So it doesn't even entirely solve the problem, because residents can still attempt to enforce the deed as written against each other. So, could the MUD just stop enforcing the deed restrictions altogether? Yes, they could. And on its face, that may sound like a reasonable idea, especially if you're someone who is wary of government. But let's think about how that would work, and I'll tell you why I think it's not a great idea, beyond the fact that the district has already been there, done that, and it didn't go well. If the MUD stopped enforcement, that would not mean the deed restrictions go away. You still signed a contract agreeing to abide by those rules when you bought your home, and it is the right of any property owner to enforce those rules against their neighbor. Now, if you're like me, part of the reason this neighborhood was attractive was because there was not an HOA, which translates to no HOA fees. But no HOA does not mean no deed restrictions. And if the MUD stops enforcement, you will still be left with those restrictions on the deed to your property, unless, by a majority vote of the residents, we vote to dissolve them. And so, if we have deed restrictions but no coordinated enforcement, there are kind of two potential outcomes to consider. The first is that the deed restrictions effectively go unenforced, which the history of our own community has shown is likely to be the case. And for some of the regulations, that would be fine. But in the case of others, this could over time lead to the degradation of property values and the slow decline of the community. And in relation to this, it's important to point out that a decline in property values, were it to happen, means a decrease in property tax revenue flowing into the district, which could, in the future, lead to a need to raise property taxes to compensate for that loss of revenue. And then number two, and this is the one I'm actually in some ways more worried about right now, if what you want in the way of deed restriction enforcement is uniformity, fairness, and equality, if what you want is collective adherence to a specific set of rules, then encouraging a situation in which deed restrictions are only enforced if and when there is a neighbor willing to enforce against another neighbor, that is not going to lead to equitable nor transparent enforcement. So think about it. If the only way any of the deed restrictions ever get enforced is if you yourself enforce them against your neighbor, how does that scenario feel to you? If you are an assertive personality, maybe that doesn't bother you. But if you're not, and I'm not, what happens when you do try to enforce the deed restrictions? How does that erode your relationship with your neighbors or the culture of your street? And then how do you ensure that the rules are uniformly enforced? If on one street there's a neighbor who's willing to enforce everything against everyone, but a block over people are less aware or less confrontational or just simply care less about deed restrictions, what happens when deed restriction enforcement becomes used as a weapon by one neighbor who just dislikes another neighbor and wants to stick it to them any way they can? All this is to say that as much as you may not like the MUD having deed restriction enforcement authority, at least when enforcement is handled by a public entity, that process becomes a part of the public record and can be managed uniformly across the neighborhood, which ultimately protects us all. Now, neither of these situations, were they to occur, would usher in the end of times. And if this is the direction the community wants to go with respect to deed restriction enforcement, then we need to have that conversation. But we need to make that decision based on a reasonable discussion of what that might actually look like for our community. Okay, so shifting gears a bit. If you live in Valente Hills, Hunters Glen, or Lakeline Oaks, why would you care about any of this? And why would you support the MUD putting resources towards improving this situation? So beyond the kumbaya answer of we're all in this together, I'll give you 3 reasons, remembering that the primary purpose of deed restrictions is to preserve property values. So reason number 1, The quality and character of development in Anderson Mill West does, to varying degrees, impact your property value, even if you don't live in Anderson Mill West, but you live in an adjacent neighborhood. Number 2, and this is an important one, Anderson Mill West has over half the properties in our district, so around 1,000 residences, which means that property values in Anderson Mill West contribute significantly to the district's overall wealth in terms of property tax revenue. Stabilizing and improving the value of homes in Anderson Mill West helps us keep district tax rates down and allows the district to provide quality amenities and services to everyone. And then third, Anderson Mill West deed restriction enforcement issues are already costing the district money, resources, and time. And unfortunately, those costs are currently being exacerbated by the fact that candidate Linda Faub is suing the district to stop the district from acknowledging the role of the Anderson Mill West Architectural Control Committee in deed restriction enforcement. The legal costs associated with this lawsuit are being paid for by us, the district taxpayers. And so my question is, what is the return on that investment? Because even if she were to win the lawsuit and the ACC is no longer acknowledged by the MUD, and the MUD has just spent tens of thousands of taxpayers' dollars defending against that lawsuit, how has that actually helped improve life for residents? Even without a functioning ACC, we'd still have the same outdated deed restrictions, along now with the added stress of a fractured trust in the system that enforces them. How does that help increase our community's wealth and long-term viability? Linda claims she will be an impeccable steward of our tax dollars. So then I want her to show us how we would be financially stronger as a result of this lawsuit. Alternatively, here are some ways I think we could invest the MUD's resources wisely to address the deed restriction situation in Anderson Mill West in a way that will benefit everyone and make our community stronger, both financially and in terms of our collaborative relationships. The first thing we could do is retain the help of professionals who are experts in deed restriction enforcement, who can take an objective look at our situation and advise and educate our board and community and help us identify a way forward. The city of Houston is famous for the fact that it has no zoning ordinance. Residential areas are governed entirely by deed restrictions, and the city of Houston even has a department dedicated to assisting neighborhoods with deed restriction enforcement. So that area of the state has a wealth of resources we could tap into to help us learn and grow. We could collect input from residents to understand where they struggle with respect to the deed restrictions, to create an inventory of what aspects of the deed restrictions are valued versus what things need to change. We could lead public meetings and roundtable discussions and develop informational resources dedicated to helping residents understand their deed restrictions and how to amend them. We could invest in collaborating with residents to amend the deed by helping to supply them with the resources needed to be successful. These are the ways I want my tax dollars invested, in strategies that benefit everyone and seek to improve our community's long-term situation, that provide a return on investment and that strengthen the relationship between the community and elected officials rather than drive a wedge between us. And I want to be clear on this. Our MUD directors have the authority to make decisions that influence our lives and our wallets. And as such, they should be held accountable for their decisions and behavior. They should be encouraged to do better when their efforts fall short. And it is incumbent upon them to do the work necessary to earn the people's trust every day they are in office. However, they are also your neighbors. And the divisive culture of shame and fury that plagues our national politics does not have to infiltrate our community. The responsibility of building a culture of connection and trust belongs to all of us. Now, if you're still feeling uneasy about the idea of the MUD investing resources in Anderson Mill West deed restriction situation, I do think this could be an appropriate way for the Anderson Mill West Neighborhood Association and the MUD to work collaboratively, as they've done so many times in the past, to utilize beautification funds to accomplish some of these goals. There's roughly $13,000 in Anderson Mill West Beautification Fund right now, which is comprised of the money collected in deed restriction violation fines. So it's completely separate from tax dollars, and it has no impact on the district's operating budget. And I think that that would be an entirely appropriate way to utilize some of those funds. So this has been a long video, and kudos to you if you've listened to the whole thing, but I just want to close with this. So many of the issues we're facing as we think about the future of our community, they aren't black and white, right or wrong, good or bad. We succeed when we acknowledge that community building is a messy, iterative process in which we all play a part. I am wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers, to know definitively what is right, and who thinks anyone who disagrees with them is not only wrong, but morally corrupt. I am a big Brené Brown fan, and in fact, her book, Dare to Lead, is one of the things that pushed me to step outside my comfort zone and run for this position. And if you haven't read any of her books, I strongly recommend them because I think her work is so central to us becoming better humans. And Brené says something that I just cherish and I think is so critical to remember as we try to navigate this world. She says, "I am here to get it right, not to be right." And ultimately, that's why I'm here now, running for this position, to get it right for and with all of you. Thank you for listening, and please comment with any additional questions you may have. Have a lovely evening.